Let me out. America locks up more people for more time than other countries. Maybe that's why crime's down. She says no.
The criminal justice system is really just a big, failed government program.
The swing Supreme Court justice is upset.
Our resources are being misspent. Our punishments are too severe.
And I'm upset that this Tea Party leader was locked up for doing the right thing, telling authorities he had a licensed gun.
Government is the problem!
We have so many laws, you could end up in here.
I never would have thought they would have did what they done to me.
Justice for all? That's our show tonight.
And now, John Stossel.
We all want justice. If you rob or hurt someone, I want you locked up. If you're likely to do it again, I want you locked up a long time. Throw away the key. But wait a second, throw away the key? Is that fair? People do make one-time mistakes. Even repeat criminals often go straight when they get older and smarter. So what's the right sentence? Maybe it's best to leave that to the judge. The judge knows the circumstances, has heard the evidence. Judicial discretion is a phrase I used to hear a lot. I hear it less now because now we have more mandatory sentences. That's when politicians decide that anyone who breaks a certain law must be jailed for at least so many years. Bill O'Reilly wants more mandatory minimums.
You go away, and the judge doesn't have discretion. We had to do that because some judges were giving these criminals probation or a couple of years prison time. I had to go on a national campaign to get child predator laws passed. That's why you need mandatory sentences.
Really? Elise Wheel says Bill's right. She's a former prosecutor. But Julie Stewart says Bill and Lise are wrong. Julie runs a group called FAM, Families Against Mandatory Minimums. What's wrong, Julie, with these minimums? Lise will say puts pressure on the bad guys.
Well, I think it also captures a lot of people who aren't bad guys and puts them in prison for a very long time. I know personally, because my brother went to prison for 5 years for growing marijuana, that when he was convicted, I thought, well, you know, marijuana, it's not so serious. But the judge at his trial, at his sentencing, said, I'm sorry, I have to give you 5 years because Congress has passed these laws that tie my hands. And it was eye-opening for me. I had no idea that judges no longer had the discretion to sentence people to the sentence they thought was appropriate.
Nor should they have the discretion, frankly, because if you've got somebody in Idaho that commits a bank robbery with a gun, all right, that's an additional charge, and you've got somebody in Maine does the same bank robbery. Let's say they take $10,000 from the teller, 2 tellers, terrorize those tellers. They wind up in a federal prison together. The guy in Idaho gets 3 years. The guy in Maine gets 15 years. What?
Because
that doesn't make any sense.
One judge decided this guy is likely to do it.
Judicial discretion, though.
So what?
That doesn't happen. What? You're fine with that? You're fine with 2 people committing the same crime?
The system is filled with inequities.
No. How many cases have you prosecuted in the federal courts?
None.
Yeah, I have. Okay, thank you very much. I was a federal
you were
prosecutor.
In Washington
I know
State.
mandatory minimums work.
How?
They work.
Why?
Incentivize people. Okay, you got the low-level drug guy. You say, okay, come on in. Come on in. You're looking at a 5-year mandatory minimum for that drug bust. If you talk to me, if you give up the higher-ups, I'm going to get a lesser sentence for you. I can do that as a prosecutor and a judge. And by the way, John, the judge only sees the very end of the story. The prosecutor is the one who sees it from the beginning to the end.
And the prosecutor has too much power. The prosecutor gets to decide not only what the charge is, but what the sentence is.
Let's go through my scenario one more time. I get this guy in. It's a 5-year mandatory, okay? That's a low-level beef. And I say,
helps you threaten him, so he'll cooperate.
Sorry, that's how it works.
You can already put him in jail. Why do you need a bigger sentence?
No, because if I look at you and I say, you're looking at 5-year mandatory, if you help me find the big guy or the bigger guys or the bigger ladies or whatever it is, if you help me find those people.
Or make up a story about some innocent person.
That's why we have lie detector tests.
What if they don't have anybody to trade up? What if they don't?
They
No,
always
they don't
do.
always.
99%. Again,
They don't always.
If you guys... I prosecuted these cases.
And I've been running this organization for 21 years. I've seen thousands of cases. I know people
Julie,
don't have
go
something
through a
to
couple of your
prosecute.
cases so we get a feel for what's happened to people. Marissa Alexander, 31-year-old mother of 3. her ex-husband or abusive husband is outside the door threatening her.
Right. And she has had a restraining order against him because he has put her in the hospital before because he's been abusive before. So she's afraid for her life. She runs out to the garage to leave. The keys are in the house, she realizes. She pulls her legally registered firearm out of the car, goes back in, points it, at the floor and says, go. And he says no, and she shoots into the ceiling. He flees with his 2 children who are with him, and then he turns her in. The judge still has no choice but to give her 20 years. The prosecution offered her a 3-year plea bargain.
She did not
because
take
she
it.
felt she was defending herself.
But she wasn't.
It was self-defense.
She was not.
I mean, she was
left the
trying to
house.
kill him and she missed?
She went out of the house. She went out of the house. She could have gotten in that car and sped off. She did not do that.
She didn't
chose
have the
to go.
keys.
She was angry. She chose to go back in and confront and not fire in the ceiling, but fire right at those 2 kids.
No.
Not at the
She did
kids.
not fire at the kids.
They
No
were
one
right-
has said.
they were right
no
there.
one has said.
You
Read the
look at the bullet
transcripts.
holes.
Nothing
All right,
about.
do one more
sentencing,
case.
firing
Michael
kids.
Keating, 17 years old, caught smoking weed. At
Right.
24, he allowed a friend to manufacture meth on his property. Tell the story.
He lived in Missouri. Everybody around him was using methamphetamine. He eventually became addicted at age 20. He let some friend make methamphetamine in his backyard. Someone informed on him. And so the police arrived. They find the wastewater that the methamphetamine was made in. It had about 1 gram's worth of actually methamphetamine in it. They weighed the wastewater and said, this is 2 kilos worth of wastewater. Therefore, we're going to sentence you for 2 kilos worth of methamphetamine. They never charged him with distributing. They charged him for having a gun, which was in his house, 2 legally registered firearms. So he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. He's still doing time.
That's a lot, but you've got to think of who. If you're the prosecutor, you're prosecuting that case. Who is that guy going to get me to? He's going to get the friend.
No, he didn't.
Well, that's a bad prosecutor then.
No, but that's the point, is that not everybody has somebody to inform on. And
Just do one more
disagree.
case. Last case. Tim Tyler. Sold LSD, sentenced to life in prison?
Yes, Tim Tyler is one of the Grateful Dead's deadheads. During the 80s, he followed the Grateful Dead all over the country. He got caught up in using LSD, like many deadheads did, and twice was convicted for having LSD in Florida, got probation, didn't do any prison time. The 3rd time, he was sold LSD to a confidential informant who basically turned him in, and he was sentenced to life without parole because in 1994 the federal government passed a crime bill that allowed the 3rd strike to send you to prison for life without parole.
Do you want that guy in your neighborhood?
Yes, I do. You know what? He was 25 years old.
You don't want that guy next to your children?
I have
I'm sorry.
2 children. I would feel
really want them
perfectly
next?
safe with him next door.
Well, I don't.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
He was 25 years old. He's been in prison since 1994. So he's
but at least
now
when you-
he's
one
now
mistake,
44
second mistake,
years
third
old.
mistake.
He's 44.
I don't
How
want
long
that
do we
guy-
have to keep him there?
I don't want that guy in my neighborhood. I'm sorry.
But, Lise, in terms of how long he should be in your neighborhood or not in your neighborhood, why is it better for Congress to set one-size-rule-fits-all than a judge who hears the evidence?
But you're wrong about that because most cases end up in pleas. What happens in a plea? Does a judge hear everything? No. A judge hears a soliloquy from the prosecutor, stands up and says what they've agreed to as, this is what he did, this is what he didn't do. And then they have a sentencing. Again, the prosecutor and defense are able to argue. The judge doesn't hear all the facts. The judge is not there looking at all the evidence that the prosecutor and the defense lawyer are going through for months, if not years.
And you want us to trust the prosecutor. But prosecutors know that they get elected to higher office if they have a line of scalps from Rudy Giuliani to Elliot Spitzer.
That's not true. If you're an assistant U.S. attorney, which is I was, you're not elected.
But
Okay, it's not a
prosecutors-
political
career
no.
goes forward.
It does. And prosecutors get it wrong. I'm not saying that every judge is going to get it right every time, but prosecutors get it wrong too. And that's all you have to do is look at all the people on death row who have been exonerated in the last 20 years, and we know they're getting it wrong.
That's different. That's a very
prosecutors
different
are
thing.
prosecuting
That's a
cases
very
that are
different thing.
wrong.
We're talking about murder cases there.
No,
That's
no.
very different
Why would
from all
they
the
be,
kind of cases we're talking
why
about
would
right
they
now.
be more careful in a drug case than a murder case?
Well, because it's a murder case, don't you think?
Yeah, and they're less careful in the murder cases. I don't get your reasoning. I mean, to me, it's that they're not going to get it right all the time. And why should this one size fits all sentence apply to everybody?
I want to cover some of these sentences. They started years ago. We have robbery by a pirate. You automatically get a life sentence. This was in the law once. Now we have Florida, 7 grams of LSD, automatic 15 years. One big one was in 1951. Hale Boggs sponsored a bill. This is Cokie Roberts' father. He was upset about drug use in teens. A 2-year minimum sentence for first offenses, including simple possession, made no distinction between drug users and traffickers. He said users should be quarantined. So these politicians compete to see, we're going to make you safer by locking them up longer.
If you're going back to 1951 and this program,
we've only added
to give
to it
me
since then.
an example, you got to work a
you
little
know what
harder
he's
than that.
doing is he's pointing out that the Boggs Act was then repealed in 1970,
Nixon
and
threw it
Nixon
out, said it
signed
didn't work.
the bill.
And the mandatory sentencings have been released now. They've been relieved, so the judges have more discretion. But I, as a prosecutor, former prosecutor, I believe in them. I believe they incentivize people. If you come in, you're in that horrible position of saying, I'm going away for 5 or 10 or 20 years. You kind of want the 5 years. So what are you going to give me as a prosecutor? You're going to give me a lot. You're going to give me
so
everything.
So our criminal
you can
justice
give me.
system basically comes down to coercion.
Thank you both.
But
These
not
prosecutors
coercion.
scare me to death. But thank you. Coming up, are we all equal under the law? How about you and Lindsay Lohan? Are you equal? And what if you can get a president to commute your sentence? That's next. He grew marijuana. He intended to sell it, but he got caught. He was then sentenced to more than 24 years in jail. And under the mandatory minimum sentence rule, no chance of parole. And yet today, 24 years isn't up. And here he sits, Peter Neinmeyer, former marijuana seller. So how come you're not in jail?
Because on the greatest day of my life, former President Bill Clinton commuted the remaining 14 and a half years I had left on my federal mandatory minimum sentence, and I became a free man. Thanks in large part to Families Against Mandatory Minimums, my federal government defender, and a lot of folks that really supported me over the years while I was in prison.
You served 10 years and then got out. And then a few years later, the president came to Kansas to make a speech. That's where Peter lives. Peter got a chance to talk to him. A Kansas NBC station covered that.
President Clinton worked his way along the security fence, shaking hands and taking pictures.
He goes, oh, you're the guy that was in the paper. He says, oh, I'm so proud of you. God bless you. I said, no, Mr. President, God bless you. We both had tears in our eyes, and it was just awesome.
All right, so that was a happy moment, and he commuted your sentence the day that President Bush was inaugurated?
Mm-hmm.
So
I was getting ready to go eat chow, and I had kind of given up on my commutation, and I got news that I needed to come to the unit in the Lower West unit. I actually was afraid that maybe another family member had something terrible happen, because 4 months previous to that, my mother died while I was in prison.
If you're now a drug counselor, you counsel other people who have drug problems.
Addictions and mental health therapist, licensed social worker.
All right, but President Clinton commuted 36 sentences on that day. You got off because the sentencing judge, Richard Rogers, wrote to the president about the excessiveness of your sentence. There is little disagreement, he said, among judges and academics that the long-term incarceration of drug offenders is ineffective and a huge drain on taxpayers. And the president commutes your sentence, and that's great. But there are thousands of these sentences. You got to know the right politician. You got to have a friendly judge. This doesn't seem fair.
I have a lot of survivor's guilt about the thousands of people that I left behind in federal prison that I feel are equally or more deserving. A lot of those would be women who left behind children. I have a 9-year-old daughter now. I can't imagine what it would be like to be separated from her. So, you know, that was part of it, but also a big part of it was Families Against Mandatory Minimums and getting, you know, this brought to President Clinton's attention.
President Clinton admits he smoked weed and had some mandatory minimum been around, and had he been caught, and yet he's presiding over a system that locks people like you up. It just seems really
Hypocritical, you think? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Had you even heard of mandatory minimums when you got hauled off to jail?
No, I really never. No, it was, I'd had some other scrapes with the law, but this was the first time I was looking at prison, and I was looking at...
I mean, some people say if we know that the bad guy, it's you, the bad guy, knows there's a mandatory minimum, but most criminals don't even know about it.
No, actually, you're so caught up in the lifestyle and addiction and the whole thing, you're so separated from that. I mean, I come from a really great family, and it just took over my life. Started off with marijuana, and that was primarily my drug of choice, and it just, you're just captured. I became, in my own prison, if you will.
But the politicians argue these drugs hurt people. We got to lock people up longer. That'll teach them a lesson. That'll solve the problem.
Okay, well, here's the deal. I needed intervention. And I really, being in prison and actually having some accountability and stopping my cycle with my drugs, my associates, and lifestyle, I mean, truly, I needed some help there. And I needed to be held accountable. But did I need 24 and a half years? I think myself and a whole lot of people, half or more of the people I saw in federal prison were people like myself. They were good people, got on a wrong track, and just to throw away their lives, which is what I felt like it was. I felt like it said I was incorrigible, I was non-rehabilitative, and I was never going to have another chance at life if I wouldn't be the luckiest guy on the planet.
Well, I'm glad you got out, thanks to President Clinton. Peter Neinmeyer, thank you. Coming up, how my town punishes people who try to do the right thing. Every state has its own laws, and you have to obey the laws of your state. But what if you travel in America? Do you know what the law is in my town? In every state in America, well, not in Illinois, most every state, every other state, it's now legal to carry a handgun if you have a permit for it, to carry it with you. And millions of Americans do in 49 states. But there are so many different rules about exactly where it's legal to carry that hundreds of well-meaning people that try to do the right thing, go to jail because they didn't know the gun law here or there. And one of those people is Mark Meckler. Mark, what happened to you?
Well, on December 15th of last year, I was traveling. I come to New York regularly, and I was actually traveling.
You're a Tea Party activist.
I'm a Tea Party activist. I've been involved in the movement for 3 years. Thanks.
In fact, you got the gun and the carry permit because some people didn't like Tea Party activists and you wanted to defend yourself.
My family was receiving threats, and so we decided it would be a good idea to protect ourselves.
All right, so you live in California and you're going to Virginia.
I was on my way to Virginia, actually for a shooting Christmas party in Virginia. And I had stopped off in New York, and I was transiting through New York, and I was checking in at LaGuardia at about 5 in the morning on December 15th.
So you took a flight to New York, got off, stayed in a hotel, went back to fly to Virginia.
Exactly. Went to the airport, like I've done so many times all across the country, and went through the process of checking in with an unloaded handgun in a locked case.
And that you have to have the special TSA-approved locked case? That's something like this?
That's it. The TSA requires a hard-sided case with locks on it.
Okay. You had that?
I had that. I walked up to the counter and I asked for a handgun declaration form, which I'd done all over the country, and filled it out and gave it to the ticket agent. She said she was going to call the Port Authority police over, which is common to have it inspected. It's different in every airport. Then the police came over and they asked me if that was my firearm. I said yes. They asked me if I had a permit for it in New York City. I said no, and they said they were placing me under arrest.
And you went to jail?
I not only went to jail, but right there at LaGuardia in front of everybody, they put my hands behind my back, handcuffed me, did the perp walk out to the squad car and stuffed me in the back of a squad car and took me to jail.
Charged you with a felony, carrying a concealed weapon with intent to do harm.
Yes.
Did you intend to do harm?
Absolutely not. And they presented no evidence that I intended to do harm. It's also interesting, John, because in New York, apparently, carrying means in a locked case in your luggage, and loaded means that you have a handgun and you have ammunition somewhere. But I was never actually carrying it. It was never actually loaded. It was an unloaded weapon locked in a TSA-approved case.
And as you went to court, you say the law enforcement officials were laughing about how stupid this was?
They were actually more frustrated that this was going on. And when I got booked in Queens Central, and the booking officer was furious because he said they have real criminals to deal with. They have real problems. And having to process a guy like me through the system doesn't make any sense.
And as far as the disruption to your life, the prosecutors told your lawyer it's no big deal.
No big deal. And my lawyer responded, you didn't get to talk to his wife at 6 in the morning, who'd gotten the call at 3 in the morning California time that her husband was in jail in New York City.
Let's go to a similar case. A med student from Tennessee went to the 9/11 memorial here in New York and saw a no gun sign. So she asked the police where she could check her gun, her licensed gun. The police, instead of taking her gun and checking it or explaining to her that even licensed guns are illegal in this city, charged her with a felony that comes with a minimum 3.5-year jail term. My beloved mayor, Michael Bloomberg, has become something of an anti-gun zealot, was asked whether the med student should get a break. He responded with a good example of political arrogance.
Well, number one, I don't know why anybody doesn't know what New York state gun laws are. We've been talking about it. We've been testifying in Washington. But, let's assume she didn't get arrested for carrying a gun. She probably would have gotten arrested for the cocaine that was in her pocket. We have any other questions? Yes, miss. Let's be the last one.
Ha, ha, ha. Everybody there was laughing. But what's funny? The police reported there was white stuff in her pocket. The mayor assumed it was cocaine. It turned out to be aspirin. 3 months later, after lots of media criticism, the prosecutor dropped the felony charge. She paid a fine of $200. But the prosecutor could have wrecked her life. And this happens often?
It happens, according to my attorney, over 300 times a year here in New York. And all of those people are people who are trying to abide by the laws, who are carrying guns according to legal permits, and people like me who declare them at the airports. And, Bloomberg laughs about it. The prosecutor said it's no big deal. John, I can tell you, when you feel those handcuffs close on your wrists, you understand the thin line between liberty and tyranny. It's a serious situation.
And in addition to arrogance, I would add the narcissism of the politicians. Oh, everyone must know what our very different laws are. Well, people have lives. They don't read the laws at every new place.
I'm a lawyer, and I actually research the laws when I travel with my handgun, and I research state laws. I had no idea that cities had individual laws. And the reality is, if cities across the country can do this, then there really is no Second Amendment, because it's impossible for any individual to know the laws in every city. And those laws are constantly changing. So not only cannot know them, but they change every day.
Mayor Bloomberg said these laws are important. There are just too many guns on the streets. We have to do something about it. Keep guns out of the hands of criminals.
So I'd like to ask the mayor, what purpose was served? How did we make New York City safer by arresting and charging somebody like me or somebody like Meredith Graves? The reality is it's an illegal, unconstitutional gun confiscation scheme.
Well, Mayor Bloomberg, we invite you on the show to answer his question. I hope you will come. Thank you, Mark Meckler. Coming up, more horrible stories. Could this happen at your house?
Go, go, go! Get to the door! Shoot my dog! Stay to the dog!
Drug raids like this one happen in America more than 100 times every day.
What did I do?
On this raid, a SWAT team broke into this family's house, shot their dog. Once inside, they didn't find any drugs. The owner was just charged with possessing drug paraphernalia. The drug war is the main reason America jails more people than any other country. I'm not going to debate the merits of the drug laws now. That's for another show. But I want to talk about the tactics like that raid. Such raids are increasing in number, and sometimes the police make mistakes. Here's another case. Corey May was sleeping on his couch in Mississippi one night when he woke to a loud banging on the door.
I thought somebody was actually breaking in. All they had to do was just knock and announce, and it never would have happened.
The it was, well, I'll let his lawyer explain.
He got his pistol, ran to the back bedroom where his daughter was, and he had just gotten there when the door was kicked in, and a figure came in, and he fired. he being Corey. Fired 3 shots.
The man at the door was a police officer. One of those shots killed him. Corey was arrested, charged with murder, and sent to death row. And there he sat for years before journalist Radley Balco started reporting on the injustice of the raid and what happened to Corey. So, Radley, tell the story.
Well, I was researching, actually I was a policy analyst for the Cato Institute at the time, and I was researching a paper on these tactics, on the use of these SWAT teams. And there's been about a 1,500% increase in the use of these sorts of raids in the last 25 years or so, mostly because of the drug war. So I had reviewed a lot of these raids when I was researching this paper, and I came across Corey's case, and I found like an Associated Press write-up and a local news write-up. And all of them explained exactly what you just said, that there was a raid on Corey's house, that he woke up in the middle of the night, there were people breaking into his house. He had no prior criminal record. They basically found a burnt marijuana cigarette in the house. That was all they found. And he lived next to a known drug dealer. So it was pretty clear that they had intended to get the apartment next to his and had raided him by mistake. So these were a lot of red flags. So there are 2 sort of scenarios here, right?
But he did kill a cop.
He absolutely did, and I mean, there's no question about that. So that you have two scenarios here. The prosecution's case is that this guy who had no criminal record, no drugs to speak of in his house, woke up, knew that these were cops breaking into his house, decided to take them on with his little handgun, shot and killed just one of them, and then immediately surrendered with bullets still left in the gun. The other scenario is that he didn't know there were cops, that he woke up and thought he was being robbed or invaded. He had an 18-month-old daughter asleep on his bed, and that he was terrified.
If we're going to have drug laws, and if drugs do hurt people, many Americans say, this just goes with the territory.
Yeah, these are really aggressive tactics, right? When you break into somebody's home in the middle of the night, when you kick their door down,
we used to have SWAT teams for terrorists or serious threats.
Emergency situations, right? Bank robberies or hostage takings. Now they're overwhelmingly used to serve search warrants for drug crimes, and usually pretty low-level crimes. So, you elicit a very primitive response from someone when you break into the home in the middle of the night, right? It's fight or flight.
Home is your sanctuary, you think.
It's your castle, right? It's your place of refuge. And you can't really flee when you wake up in your home to armed men in your home. Wake up in your bed to armed men in your home. So you're faced with this very sort of primitive decision. And, I mean, in a case like Corey, I mean, he had no reason to think that these were cops coming into his home. And if you actually are a drug dealer, you might suspect that that's the case, right? But all the times that these cops that break into people's houses and get the wrong house by mistake, they're put in this really terrible position.
Some people want an even tougher drug war. They say these raids make America safer.
We should be kicking down more doors.
Paul Chabot was a White House drug czar advisor under President Bush and Clinton.
They're not kicking the door if somebody's smoking a doobie on their couch. They're kicking the door of somebody who's a violent person with a known history to be dangerous.
When they get it right, sometimes they make mistakes, terrorize people.
Because that accident happens should not be the reason that we do away with the program.
Because of an accident, we shouldn't do away with the program.
Yeah, I would dispute his premise also, though. They're supposed to only do these sorts of raids when the person is violent or has a history of violence. What we're seeing is that just the fact that this person is suspected to have drugs is usually enough for the police to claim that they're violent so that they can get the warrant to make these kinds of entries. And I would say, this is more dangerous for cops, too. I mean, drug dealers, I think they usually think it's a rival drug dealer that's breaking into their house.
Let's move on to another aspect of the drug law and prosecution, civil forfeiture. What's that?
In sort of the height of the drug war hysteria, Congress passed this law and a lot of states followed suit that said the police can take your stuff away from you even if you aren't convicted of the crime. And in fact, even if you're never charged with the crime. And what they do is the police will take your property and they'll say, we found some evidence that this is in some way connected to drug activity. And you now have to prove that you earned that property legitimately.
And the incentives, when the cops can make money from
the money goes back to the police department.
It's just one example. Russell and Pat Caswell are about to have the motel they own taken by the government.
Not because the Caswells broke any laws, but because the local police department wants to cash in on the Caswells' property.
Worth more than $1 million. Because a tiny fraction of people who've stayed at the Motel Caswell during the past 20 years have been arrested for crimes.
Civil forfeiture allows the government to take property it merely suspects has some involvement with a crime. But unlike criminal forfeiture, where property can only be taken if the owner is convicted of a crime, Police can use civil forfeiture to take away cash, cars, homes, or other property without convicting or even charging the owner with any wrongdoing. The U.S. Department of Justice and the local police will split a payout of more than $1 million if they can successfully seize and sell the Caswell's land.
Now, that's involved in a lawsuit, but I have trouble thinking of the Justice Department and the local cops as just thieves.
Well, I mean, if you look at this case, the Caswell case, the government admits that the owners of this motel have not committed any crimes. They're trying to take their motel away from them because they're saying they weren't doing enough to prevent crimes from occurring on their property. Now, this is sort of the next step in asset forfeiture. It's no longer that we suspect you did anything. Now it's you need to do more to prevent other people from committing crimes on your property. And coincidentally, that often includes hiring members of the local police department to work off-duty security at your motel. Coincidentally, of course.
And just as SWAT team raids have increased, these forfeitures have increased. In 1986, they confiscated $93 million. Pretty good. But 2008, more than $1 billion. So it's always more. More laws, more enforcement.
And we're now to the point where a lot of police departments actually write forfeiture proceeds into their budget. So this is no longer money that's buying, cappuccino machines and, extra fancy police cars.
Which there were cases of cappuccino machines.
There's a
trips to Hawaii.
Margarita machine in one case, yeah. But now the officers' actual salaries is dependent on them finding people to forfeit property and money to the police department.
Different incentives for the police. Thank you, Radley Balco. Coming up, what do President Obama and Lindsay Lohan have in common? But next, your questions for our guests. We're back now with your comments and questions for my guests. Mark Meckler of the Tea Party Patriots, Fox News legal analyst Lise Wheel, Julie Stewart, founder of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and blogger Radley Balco. And Radley, during the commercial, I realized we talked about Corey May and the horrible thing that happened to him, but we didn't tell the end of the story.
Yeah, he's actually out now. So he was on death row when I first discovered the case, and I wrote a little bit about it. A law firm in D.C., a partner there, read about the case online, and he got...
Partly because of you.
And partly because of me, and he got representation then. Eventually the death sentence was thrown out, and he was given a new trial. And I think the prosecutors decided they didn't want to try him again, so they offered him a manslaughter deal with time served. So the long story short is that he got out in July and was finally able to go home.
He's a free man now. Next, from my Facebook page, Simon Tompkins asks, why is ignorance of the law no excuse when nobody can possibly know it all? And, I mean, Lise, you support these laws
yes,
as a prosecutor.
I do. Okay, let's think about that. Okay, if I leave a little garbage on the floor, well, that might be illegal in some places and not illegal in others. If I walk across the crosswalk when there's a no crossing, that might be illegal in some place and not others. If I rob a bank or murder somebody or deal in drugs, I kind of know it's illegal in every state.
We have 10,000 laws. We have more than the Congressional Research Service can count.
That's not the mandatory minimums. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about laws, mostly drug cases, but laws that every citizen in this country knows that they are violating when they do that.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I'd like to address this question to Mr. Meckler. I understand that you had issues arise when you brought your gun into New York City and declared it. But I have to wonder if there wouldn't have been anything that you could have done as an attorney to research the laws of New York State or New York City.
Yeah, you're a lawyer. Why were you carrying a gun in New York City?
I think that's a fair question. And the answer is, And I still travel with a weapon. And when I do, I consistently and constantly research the laws of the state to which I travel. And so the problem is that it becomes literally impossible. I participate in online forums. I checked software on my phone before I traveled. I brought the gun in a locked case. It never came out of the case. It was never on the streets of New York on my person. It was locked in a hotel safe while I was here. In this case,
this one's empty,
right? Nothing in here, but it was locked up the whole time. So the answer is, yeah, theoretically, I could have found out those laws. That's true. But the reality is, it would prevent carry from all over the country, knowing that you have to know every single city you travel to. I travel to hundreds of cities a year around this country.
But don't you feel some responsibility when you know you're taking a firearm to a state?
Absolutely.
Don't you feel like you should know the laws of whatever city or state you're going to?
Well, I'll tell you a story that happened in Philadelphia last year. There was a guy who was open carrying in the city of Philadelphia, which is legal under Pennsylvania law. He was arrested by Philadelphia police. They pointed their guns at his head. They threatened to kill him. Right? He said, take me to the police station. They took him to the police station. He said, I want your sergeant to look up the law. Looked up the law. The guy was right about the law. He was carrying legally. The cops got the law wrong. So now you want to talk about you need to know the law. How many of those cops do you think were arrested for violating his constitutional rights? None of them. In fact, the police chief held a press conference the next day where he announced that he would do the same thing to anyone else who was open carrying in Philadelphia, basically announcing to the entire state that he was going to openly defy the law.
So
now, how are we supposed
when
the cops aren't being held accountable? How can you hold the citizens accountable for knowing all these laws?
Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence that prison time or increased prison time actually rehabilitates people, or is it more of a retribution type measure?
Good question. Or that it reduces crimes.
Rehabilitation, deterrence, and retribution. That's our justice system. I'm sorry, that's the truth.
Well,
and sometimes it's just to get bad people off the street longer.
But is there any evidence that there's less crime in states that have a lot of mandatory minimums?
No, in fact, it's just the opposite. And Florida and New York are a perfect example. In the last 7 years, Florida has increased its incarceration by about 16%. During that same period of time, New York has decreased its incarceration by 16%.
And crime?
And crime rates in New York have dropped at twice the rate of Florida.
Depends on what crime you're looking at, too.
It's everything. And in Texas, which is leading the reform in sentencing, their violent crime rate has dropped twice as much as the national rate, and their property crime rates have come down 10%. There's absolutely a limited, if any, kind of correlation between mandatory sentences and crime.
Thank you all for being here. Next, my take and what the Soviet Union can teach us about lots of laws and mandatory minimums. Show me the man, and I'll show you the crime. That creepy quote is attributed to Beria. In the former Soviet Union, he ran the security forces for Stalin. Stalin executed anyone he considered a threat, and it didn't take much to be a threat. He executed thousands. Beria could always find some law the man must have broken. That's easy to do when laws are vague, and there are lots of them. Now, I'm not saying America is like Stalinist Russia, but look at all these laws we've now got. This just represents federal law. States and cities have more. And last week, the feds alone added another 1,000 pages. Have you read them all? This is a reason America locks up so many people. This graph shows the increase in prisoners in America. The total tripled over the past few decades. But the next graph is telling, too. It shows America locks up a much higher percentage of our people than even countries we consider repressive. China jails 121 out of every 100,000 people. In Russia, it's 511. In America, more than 700. This is not a good thing. The Economist says of America, never in the civilized world have so many been locked up for so little. Yet we keep adding more laws and longer jail terms. A few years ago, a man in Iowa found a bullet. He put it on his dresser and forgot about it. Months later, his ex-girlfriend accused him of taking some of her stuff. He let the police into his apartment to prove it wasn't true. The police saw the bullet. It turns out the man had an old felony conviction. He'd served his time. The bullet wasn't a threat. But federal law says felons cannot possess any ammunition. And so he's now serving a 15-year mandatory sentence for possessing the bullet. Really? The Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the sentence, saying our hands are tied by the mandatory minimum. Now, most of you won't be victimized by mandatory minimums or by the ambiguities in this pile of laws, but if you try to create something, build a business, there's a bigger chance that you'll fall victim to something in this pile.
Lindsay?
Celebrities get good lawyers who deal with prosecutors and allow the celebrities to move on with their lives.
I'm not taking this as a joke. It's my life.
But if you're not rich or famous and some ambitious prosecutor wants to get you, you're basically toast. The power held by police and prosecutors is immense. And it takes just one raid on a home, one publicized arrest, one trial, and your reputation is gone. And so probably is your job, your friends, and all your money. Even if you're innocent, paying your lawyers will probably bankrupt you. The drug war makes the inequity worse. Lots of politicians admit that they use drugs. Even presidents joke about it.
I inhaled frequently. That was the point.
Ha ha ha. And yet, once in office, they preside over a justice system that jails 1 million Americans for doing what they did? Give me a break. I want my government to have the power to arrest dangerous people and to lock them up if they threaten us. But our politicians today have gone way beyond that. That's our show. Thanks for watching. Good night.